You know, some comebacks are so brutal, they make you want to curl up in embarrassment. But there's also something oddly satisfying about delivering one. The kind that leaves the person completely speechless, and you just know it'll be talked about for years to come. I've had my fair share of these moments, but one particular time stands out. It was on a job site, working with a coworker named Scott. We were redoing some plumbing in an empty house, the kind of house that felt eerily quiet except for the hum of our tools. We had an iPod playing, and a song by White Zombie came on. I can't remember the exact name of it. But the intro had these audio clips of a woman having a good time, like really having a good time. I couldn't resist. I yelled across the room to Scott, "Hey, I think your wife is here." Scott, who was busy sweeping up dust after drilling a hole through some concrete, didn't even look up at first. He just scooped the dust into a dustpan, walked over to me with his slow, deliberate pace, and then, with a smirk on his face, very casually poured the dust in front of me. "Hey, Pat, your mom's here," he said. Now, here's the kicker. My mother had been cremated just 3 weeks before this happened. It was like being hit in the gut. I didn't know how to respond. It was cruel, but at the same time, it was so out of left field that I couldn't help but laugh, albeit awkwardly. If there was ever a moment in life when the record scratch meme was needed, this was it. I had no words. I was wrecked. Now, if you think that was brutal, just wait for the next story. You won't believe the comeback I heard when I was in the U.S. Air Force. I worked in quality control QC, and let me tell you, we were the bad guys. We were the ones always checking up on how aircraft and equipment were being maintained. We had black baseball caps with QC written in white letters, and we were often seen as the enemy by the techs and crews. One evening, I wandered into the avionics building just around midnight during a shift change. I didn't expect much, but one of the tech sergeants spotted me. Now, this guy, Sergeant Bowl, didn't like me much. He was surrounded by 3 young female troops, and I guess he felt the need to show off for them. He decided to mess with me. Loudly, he says, "Look out, it's QC, the gay chaser." It was a low blow, but I wasn't one to back down. Without missing a beat, I shot back. "That's right, Sergeant Bowl, I'll give you a 5-minute head start." The girls burst out laughing, and the sergeant turned bright red. He never bothered me again after that. It was one of those moments that felt like a small victory, just the right words at the right time, and the look on his face was priceless. But, as much as I love a good comeback, sometimes it's not about fighting back with words, it's about something else entirely. I used to run at a park near my house in the city, and there was this guy there who changed everything I thought I knew about running. He was known by everyone around the track, and everyone just called him Coach. Coach wasn't your typical guy who would be out there running with us. In fact, he wasn't running at all. He had a knee injury that kept him from exercising, but he would stand by the track every day, cheering people on. He was easily about 6 feet tall and weighed close to 300 pounds, but he wasn't ashamed. He had the kind of energy that could lift anyone's spirits. And every time I saw him, he was cheering for someone, no matter how fast or slow they were. He even cheered for a 70-year-old woman who was walking half a mile. I was in awe of his dedication. Then, one rainy day, the park was practically empty, just a few of us running, and Coach still showed up with his umbrella and raincoat. After my run, I decided it was time to thank him. We talked for about 10 minutes, and he told me about his past, how sports had once meant everything to him, and how he had trouble even jogging now. At the end of our conversation, I asked him why he stood out there day after day, cheering people on. He looked me in the eye and said, "You're lucky. It's easy to take a day off, to get lazy. It's easy to take for granted the ability to be out here at all. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. Next time you think of taking the easy way out, don't do it. Do it for those who can't." I'll never forget that. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest strength is not about what we do, but about showing up, especially when it's difficult. And if you think that's inspiring, just wait until you hear what happened to me in high school when I was in the marching band. We were on a school bus heading to an away football game. And you know how it is, you have a bunch of rowdy teenagers goofing around, making jokes, and being generally ridiculous. One guy in particular thought he was really good at freestyling. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. One day, he convinced someone to tap out a beat, and he started rapping. '06 is the year that we graduate. I'm about to ask Kelly on a date, out of nowhere. This super quiet kid in the back of the bus shouted, but she'll probably say no. The whole bus burst into laughter. The freestyle guy never asked for a beat again after that. I could barely breathe from laughing so hard. It was like the entire bus had been waiting for someone to finally shut him down. And when it came, it was perfection. So, I was telling you about the time when I was in high school, and one of the quiet kids shut down the wannabe freestyle rapper. That moment was just chef's kiss. But there's another time. Back in the days when I was in the United States Air Force. This time, it was all about my quick thinking that turned a situation into a major victory for me. I was working in quality control QC, and as I mentioned, we were the ones who checked if the equipment and aircraft were up to standard. QC wasn't the most beloved part of the military. We were kind of the bad guys, always making sure that things were done right. We wore these black baseball caps with QC in big white letters. And let me tell you, those caps screamed authority. One night, I wandered into the avionics building during the midnight shift change. As I walked in, a tech sergeant, one who really didn't like me, noticed me immediately. He was standing around with a few young female troops, and I could tell he was trying to impress them by messing with me. He called out loud, "Look out! Here comes QC, the gay chaser." Normally, I'd just ignore stuff like that. But this time, I didn't miss a beat. I turned right to him and said, "That's right, Sergeant Bowl. I'll give you a 5-minute head start." The girls burst out laughing, and the sergeant's face turned as red as a tomato. He couldn't say anything back, and from that point forward, he avoided messing with me. I loved how the whole thing played out. Sometimes, the best comebacks come when you least expect it. Moving on from work to something that was both heartwarming and hilarious back in the day. I used to run at a park near my house. Now, this wasn't just any park. It was a popular spot where people went to get in shape. And it had a, 5-mile gravel path around the perimeter. There were always a lot of people there, and you could barely walk a few steps without bumping into someone. But there was one guy who was always there, standing by the track with a stopwatch. He wasn't running or jogging like the rest of us. His name was Coach, and he had been a football player in his prime, but a knee injury had put an end to his athletic career. Despite that, he came to the park every single day. He was close to 6 feet tall and weighed about 300 pounds, and you could tell that he was carrying some extra weight. Coach wasn't there to run himself anymore, but he was there to cheer everyone else on. No matter who they were or what they were doing, he was one of the most enthusiastic people you'd ever meet. You could count on him to root for a 70-year-old woman walking a half-mile just as much as for someone sprinting around the track. One day, during the final weeks I spent at the park before I moved away, it started pouring rain. There were only a few of us on the track, but Coach was still out there with his umbrella and raincoat, cheering us on. After my run, I decided to thank him. We talked for about 10 minutes, and he opened up about his past, about how sports used to mean everything to him and how now, due to his knee injury, he couldn't even jog. But here's the thing that stuck with me. I asked him why he kept coming to the park every day, even though he couldn't participate anymore. And his response was something I'll never forget. He said, "You're lucky. It's easy to take a day off." To get lazy. It's easy to take for granted the ability to be out here at all. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. Next time you think of taking the easy way out, don't do it. Do it for those who can't. It was one of the most powerful things anyone has ever told me. He wasn't talking about running or sports, but about life itself. I still carry that lesson with me now. If you think those moments were intense, I've got one more from my high school days that'll make you laugh. It's about my little brother, who at the time was about 13 years old. One day, I noticed he had a black eye, and when I asked him about it, he wouldn't tell me what had happened. I could tell something was off, and he seemed a bit ashamed. So I assumed he had gotten into a fight at school. I didn't press him about it, but a few weeks later, I found out what had really happened. It all started with a kid named Joe, who had been my brother's classmate since they were in primary school. Joe had a reputation for being kind of a troublemaker, quick to fly off the handle, and always picking fights with people. One day, he decided to make fun of my brother's dad. My brother's dad had just bought a new MGF sports car, which, admittedly, had a bit of a feminine look to it. Joe, being the jerk he was, decided that would be the perfect target for a joke. While riding the bus home, Joe said to my brother, "Hey, does your dad cut hair for a living?" "He's driving a hairdresser's car. Didn't you know?" My brother, always quick on his feet, shot back. "What does your dad drive?" "A coffin, apparently." Joe didn't take too kindly to that, and he started throwing punches. But when I asked my brother about it later, he admitted that he was so ashamed of his comeback that he just took the beating rather than fighting back. Still, I couldn't help but admire his quick wit. He definitely deserves some applause for that one. It all happened when I was in the military. Now, as a member of the U.S. Air Force, I spend most of my time in quality control QC. In this role, we were the ones that made sure everything from the aircraft to the equipment was up to code. As you can imagine, we weren't the most popular bunch. Nobody liked the QC guys because we were always checking their work. But what happened one evening was more about words than work. And it left me with one of the most memorable experiences. So, I wandered into the avionics building during the midnight shift change. As soon as I walked in, a tech sergeant named Bowl, who really didn't like me, spotted me. He was surrounded by a group of young female troops, and I could see he was trying to impress them by getting under my skin. He decided to mess with me and, with a loud voice, said, "Look out, it's QC." The gay chaser. Now, I could have let that slide, but I wasn't in the mood. I didn't miss a beat. I turned and replied, "That's right, Sergeant Bowl. I'll give you a 5-minute head start." The girls burst into laughter, and the sergeant turned a deep shade of red. He had no comeback, and from that point on, avoided me like the plague. It was such a small victory, but it felt so good. Sometimes, a comeback can change the entire dynamic of a situation. Speaking of moments that made you feel like a winner, let me tell you about a guy I met while running at my local park. This guy, who everyone called Coach, was a major influence on me without even knowing it. He was probably around 40, and his knees had taken their toll over the years. Once a football player in his prime, he was now sidelined from running due to a knee injury, but that didn't stop him from spending hours at the park every day. Coach was a big guy, close to 300 pounds, and standing about 6 feet tall. But what set him apart was the way he cheered for everyone. He'd stand next to the track with his stopwatch and root for everyone who passed by. It didn't matter how fast or slow they were, he was there, clapping and encouraging them. I watched him cheer for a 70-year-old woman walking half a mile like she was running a marathon. He didn't care who you were or what you were doing. He just cared that you showed up. One rainy day, when the park was nearly empty, Coach was still out, there, umbrella in hand, cheering for us. After my run, I approached him and we talked for about 10 minutes. He opened up about how sports had meant everything to him before his knee injury, and now he couldn't even jog. I finally asked him Why he continued to come to the park every day to cheer for people when he couldn't even participate himself. His response was powerful. "You're lucky," he said. "It's easy to take a day off. It's easy to get lazy. Don't take the ability to be out here for granted. Next time you think about taking the easy way out, don't. Do it for those who can't." That hit me hard. It wasn't just about running or fitness, it was about life. We get so caught up in our own struggles and laziness that we forget there are others who would give anything to be able to do the things we take for granted. I've carried that lesson with me ever since. And the next time I was tempted to take the easy way out, I thought of Coach and his words. It was a brutal truth, but one that I'm grateful for now. Back to high school. It wasn't all about lessons and life-changing moments. Some things were just plain funny, like the time my little brother got into a fight and came home with a black eye. When I asked him about it, he refused to tell me what happened. I didn't push it, assuming he'd lost a fight. But a few weeks later, one of his friends spilled the beans. It turns out there was a kid named Joe who'd been picking on my brother for years. Joe had a reputation for being a troublemaker, and when he saw my brother's dad had bought a new MGF sports car, he decided to make fun of him. While riding the bus home, Joe asked my brother, "Hey, does your dad cut hair for a living? He's driving a hairdresser's car. Didn't you know?" My brother, always quick with a comeback, shot back, "What does your dad drive?" "A coffin." Joe wasn't happy with the response and decided to punch my brother. But the best part, my brother was so embarrassed by his comeback that he just let Joe beat him up rather than fighting back. Honestly, I think he was more ashamed of being too witty for his own good than of losing the fight. Still, it was a pretty solid comeback, and I was proud of him for standing his ground. Even if it cost him a few punches. Let me take you to another moment of brutal honesty. And this one was particularly savage. It happened in high school when I was hanging out with my ex. We had always been great at insulting each other, but things took a sharp turn one night. We were sitting with a group of friends, and as we were all drinking, the insults started flying. It wasn't long before she made a joke about let's just say it was about my manhood. I couldn't resist the temptation to respond, and when I did, it was brutal. Even a 747 looks small when it flies into the Grand Canyon, but with you, it's like dropping a toothpick into a volcano, I said. The group went silent, but then her new boyfriend, who had been sitting there awkwardly, started laughing. The tension in the room broke, but I could tell he was dying inside. The best part, her dad laughed too and asked me to leave. It was the perfect end to that chapter of my life. I had won that round, but don't think I've only had one great comeback in a group setting. I once had another moment when I had to show up someone's ego in a big way. This time, it wasn't in a bar or with friends, but at a concert. I was at a Mumford & Sons show, and after the gig, I managed to get my hands on the set list from one of the stagehands. As I was about to grab it, a lady, let's call her the witch, snatched it right out of my hands and shoved it into her purse. I didn't let that slide. I confronted her about it, and she just laughed and said, "Well, you were too slow." But the best comeback came from me. I just looked at her and said, "Well, maybe you should have been faster, and a little thinner, too." She immediately burst into tears, and I couldn't help but feel a little bit of satisfaction. I mean, what kind of person snatches a set list from someone who worked so hard for it? Sometimes people get exactly what they deserve, and in this case, she did. Let's start with a classic high school drama, but with an unexpectedly savage twist. I used to take a lot of crap from the jocks in high school. I wasn't exactly what you'd call the athletic type. I was into rock climbing, and apparently that was an easy target for ridicule. One of these guys, let's call him Jake, used to make fun of me relentlessly. mocking me every chance he got. He thought rock climbing was lame, and he never let me forget it. One day, during homeroom, Jake decided to call me out. He looked over and in that mocking, taunting tone, said, "Hey, bikes and rocks. I bet I can climb a rock faster than you can." His group of friends snickered, thinking this was going to be another one of those moments where I'd just keep quiet and let it slide. But not this time. Without even blinking, I turned to him and said, "Well, that may be, but I bet you can eat a Johnson faster too." That's what happens when you have a lot of practice. The entire room went silent for a moment. Then, the snickering started, loud, uncontainable laughter from his friends. Jake's face turned redder than a tomato, and he didn't say another word. I'll never forget how he walked away, fuming, and from that day on, he never bothered me again, in fact. It kind of earned me a little respect around the school. Not bad for a comeback that didn't even require a single punch thrown. Now, let's switch gears to another story from high school that proves not all comebacks have to be savage to be funny. I was sitting in English class one day when a girl in front of me, a classic Stacy type, turned around and said, "You, who reads for fun?" She was holding her Kindle Fire like she was the queen of the world, and I was just sitting there, quietly reading my book, without skipping a beat. I responded, "I'd be surprised if you could read." The whole class went quiet for a second. Then she started to make a big scene, yelling for her friends to back her up. But I wasn't done yet. Before anyone could say anything, I added, "Relax. It's just a joke. Don't take it so hard." The teacher, who adored me for some reason, patted me on the back and said, "That was amazing." It felt like the greatest moment of my life, at least in high school. I didn't even have to do anything aggressive. Just a few well-timed words, and it was game over. The whole class was laughing, and Stacy didn't know what hit her. But let's take a moment to acknowledge the ultimate level of a savage comeback. This one happened to a guy who, well, let's just say he thought he was the king of everything. I was hanging out with some friends, including my ex-her new boyfriend and a couple of others, when the insults started flying. My ex was getting a bit personal, and as usual, I wasn't going to take it lying down. At one point, she started talking about, let's say, the size of my Johnson. Now, if there's one thing you don't do, it's challenge me when it comes to a good insult. I wasn't even thinking about it, just one smooth, brutal line after another. I hit her with this gem. Even a 747 looks small when it flies into the Grand Canyon. But with you, it's like dropping a toothpick into a volcano. The room went dead silent, and my ex's new boyfriend sank into his chair, wondering what in the world he had gotten himself into. Her dad, however, couldn't contain his laughter and asked me to leave. That was a perfect exit for me. Honestly, it was a brutal line, and I could see my ex's face fall, but I couldn't help but feel like I'd won that round hands down. Here's one more from the same ex. It was a little while after we had broken up, and we were hanging out with a big group of friends. It was all casual at first, but as soon as the drink started flowing, the jokes took a personal turn. She decided to make another jab about my Johnson size. I wasn't about to let her have the last laugh this time. I took a breath and calmly whispered, "It's big enough to give you jaw lock." I couldn't believe it myself when it came out. But the best part, her dad was sitting right there and laughed, and then casually asked me to leave. There's something satisfying about knowing you can shut someone down with a single perfect line. All right, let's get back to some more classic, quick-witted comebacks. I've got one from a time I was at a party with some friends. We were all just hanging out, drinking, and minding our own business when this girl started fishing for compliments. She was one of those people who was always a little insecure about her appearance, and she asked, "Oh my God, I look so ugly without makeup on, without even looking up from my pizza." I casually said. Yeah, you do. The room went dead silent for a second, and then she looked at me in shock. What did you say? She asked, clearly expecting me to backtrack. I just kept eating my pizza. And she walked away, completely flustered. Honestly, I didn't think it would be as brutal as it was. But it was a moment that still gets brought up when we talk about that night. Even my coach, who was standing next to me, couldn't stop laughing. And here's a fun one. This wasn't exactly a comeback, but it was one of those moments that had everyone around me laughing. I was at a bar, and a guy walked in, acting all tough and macho. He came up to me and said, "You want a cigar?" I was totally caught off guard, but without even thinking, I replied, "Thanks for the offer, bro, but you gotta light that little one first, or else I can't help you." His face went pale, and then he burst out laughing. The room was silent for a moment, and then everyone started cracking up. I couldn't believe it worked, but it did. Finally, let's close this out with a moment from my job. I worked at a gas station, and let me tell you, dealing with customers could sometimes be like navigating a minefield. There was one woman who was particularly difficult. She came in one day, demanding $20 in pump number 4. She stormed in, claiming the pump wasn't working, even though it was perfectly fine. After explaining how our pumps work differently from others, she snapped, "I know how to use a pump. I'm not stupid." Without missing a beat, my coworker, who had the best reactions to difficult situations, looked at her and said, "Ma'am, I understand that the technology used for these pumps is far advanced for you, but let me show you how to use it. I'm surprised you can even operate a car if you can't figure out how to operate a nozzle." She just stood there, speechless, and walked away in a huff. It was savage, but it was also hilarious. The best part, she never came back. And with that, we reached the end of the most brutal comebacks I've ever witnessed or been part of. It's been a ride, sometimes savage, sometimes hilarious, but always memorable. I hope you enjoyed these stories. And remember, next time someone tries to mess with you, don't be afraid to drop a comeback. Who knows? It might just leave them speechless. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories just like these. Catch you in the next video.